Welcome to Development Economics, and today is lesson 8. Or is it lesson 7? Lesson 7, but it's a continuation. That's a part 2 of classical theories of economic growth and development. Last week we did, or is it this week? Today is the 15th of December 2023. Last week we did 2 of those theories, and today we're going to do the remaining 2. We did the linear stage model or theory, and then we did the structural change theory. Today we're going to be looking at what? International dependence revolution, and then neoclassical counter-revolution. It's interesting, a revolution and then a counter-revolution. So that's what we're going to do. Learners would appreciate these thoughts because of the historical antecedent, and then how you get to know what has happened before, and you don't make the mistake in the future to cause a repetition of an unpleasant circumstance. This study is for developing economies or developing countries. The name is H. Kwame Afaglo. All right, so let's zoom into action. Today is the 15th of December 2023, like I said earlier, and let's go straight into understanding what is international dependence revolution. In the 1970s, the earlier models, economic growth models, being linear stage model or theory, and then structural change. In structural change, we have 2. That's the Lewis and then the Chinnery, or the 2-sector labor surplus model, and then the empirical model. They were failing, and because they were failing, especially with the patterns and development by Chinnery and his team, that was more of measuring international participation of developing countries in trade and other aspects. They were failing, leading to so many slums in the urban areas of developing countries. That was the time urban slums came up in developing countries in the 70s, and there was joblessness. People were losing hope, and if you're not losing hope, it was hopelessness or helplessness. And so it bottled up. It's just a bottled up, and it led to a certain kind of revolution where in the 70s in Africa and in Latin America there was so much military takeovers, and that was what happened at the time. Based on that, there was the thinking, which was more of development economics or economic development thinking. This moved the thinking must move away from the structural change pattern theory into what we call international dependence revolution. What is international dependence revolution? International dependence, it means that developing countries had then become dependent on developed economies. They were tied to the apron strings, and they were only a feeder countries. They were producing raw materials and feed developed countries. Mind you, the cost of raw materials is always cheaper than finished products. So developing countries like Africa, shipping raw materials to developed worlds, were always getting peanuts in terms of pricing of the products that they originate. Meanwhile, the developed countries finish it and make the markup, big time profit. So they were always what? Poor. Developing countries were always poor, and the developed countries were always going to be rich. That is a structure that has been defined, and that structure, there must be a revolution. So the international dependence by developing countries led to a kind of revolution, and so there are 3 of the thinkings here. That's one being the neo-colonial dependence, then 2, false paradigm, and 3, the dualistic development thesis. Let's look at the neo-colonial dependence. In the 50s and 60s, there was independence of a lot of developing countries, especially in Africa. They had gained their independence and had moved into growing their economies by themselves, managing themselves. Apparently, because they have become dependent on developed economies, there was not much they could do. They were always getting peanuts for their raw materials, in terms of peanuts, in terms of cash, for their raw products shipped or planed to Europe and Americas and China's for little. And when it's finished there, they make a lot of the markup, the profit. So they were always going to fall themselves in a certain weak position, that's poverty. So they will become, mind you, this neo-colonial They were no more in Africa or in the developing countries. The Europeans were no more living there. They are giving their independence to these countries. So they moved back to their own countries. But they have put up a structure system that was like this. So it became a conduit. See, that conduit was so defined that they were usurpers. They actually usurped the authorities of local the local authorities or the developing countries. In terms of military wise, they usurped the authority and then put in their political structure and then the administrative structure, that everything that was done was tailored towards their benefit and against the developing countries. They put in few elites or the chiefs. Then they added public servants, top public servants, to dictate their pace, some military personnel and merchants to follow their kind of system and then channel all materials to them. So these are the elites. They were only behaving like the usurpers, the Europeans, as against the majority poor developing country nationals. Like in Africa, majority were poor and the few, extremely few elites were funneling, or they became a conduit to the European usurpers. And that created so much poverty. Hitherto, there might not have been too much poverty, but because the delineation became so clear, there was so much poverty in a lot of the developing countries, especially in Africa. Okay, therefore, they became dependent on the West before they could get foreign exchange and all that. Everything they were doing was tailored towards the West, Europe and America. And that was problematic for them. And that is what even Pope John Paul said, that no, it was not right. The inequality was so high, the poverty in developing countries was so clear. Latin America, Africa, and some part of Asia. So Pope John Paul the second, he criticized that. He mentioned it, and it's something that you have to take note of. All right. Then the other bit is the false paradigm model. The false paradigm model in the 70s was such that Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF, before they could give loans, apparently they said all countries, developing countries, should stop taking loans from private banks. They should now come to them and take loans from them. Fortunately, World Bank and IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions, the board was governed by the same developed countries. So they dictate how much should be given, whether it should be given, loans should be given, how much it should be given, what conditions or preconditions or post conditions should be attached. Okay, so that is one bit that we cannot lose sight of, or we should keep an eye on. World Bank and IMF, World Bank Group and IMF. What they did was that they are experts that they brought from Europe, America, and some part of Asia, and some part of North America, knew little about Africa. They knew very little, so they proposed policies that were Eurocentric and Yankee-centric or American-centric on imposing on Africa. And it didn't sit well. It wasn't contextualized in any way. Their policies was not contextualized, so they were giving what? False information, misinformation, but either deliberately or ignorantly. That was what they did. Their policies were not suitable. The structural adjustment program had its own problems. This is what they gave Africa, and it caused so much glitches. That glitches was what Africa has not come out of up until now. The other bit is that the African intellectuals themselves, the developing country intellectuals themselves, were trained, and the trade union leaders were trained in Western countries, trained in their culture, trained in their intellectual work, trained in their academic thinking. So all that they were doing back home, when they get work back home, is to think and act Western or modernized, leaving majority of their people behind as poor. And that is what happened to developing countries. Such a circumstance where African intellectuals did not know, they became alien to themselves and conduits of developed worlds, where they could carry their own resources and pass on to the developed world, leaving the majority of their people poor. And they made sure that these few elites made sure that there was no change at all, because if there's a change, it will be at their disadvantage. So they allowed the status quo to remain as it is, unfortunately. And that's what they did. If you want to look at the third bit, which we have to look at the third bit, that is the dualist development thesis. The dualist development thesis is about two extremes. That is either the rich and the poor, superior or inferior. All right. So the world has been structured in that way. They try to put the whole world in that structure, that there are the rich countries and the poor countries. And even the poor countries, they are the rich among them and the poor amongst them. All right. So they had four of these conditions. One was what? Ensuring the superior superior and inferior um, environment or people groupings must coexist. But in their coexistence, they must be mutually exclusive. Say you get to Accra and other places in Africa, the remarkable difference between the rich and poor is a highway, where the rich are on the right hand side and the poor are on the left hand side. Watch the highways in your various African countries if you're an African, or if you happen to go to any other country, Latin America or some part of Africa, watch it carefully. There's always a highway that divides the rich from the poor, and the rich are always on the right hand side and the poor on the left hand side. The name is H. Kwame Afabio. Let's take a commercial break and come back. Okay, now that they have to coexist, the other condition is there must be some permanency in structuring such that the rich always must remain rich and the poor must always remain poor. They try to put that structure in place. They try to put that structure in place that the rich must always remain rich and the poor must remain as poor as they deem fit. The third one is that there must be a certain degree of superiority and inferiority, but that difference must be deepened so that the permanency condition is maintained between the rich and the poor. The poor should always remain poor and the rich should continue becoming rich, widening the inequality gap. And the fourth condition is the relationship between the two ends, the two pole ends. The two pole ends being the upper and the lower. The upper or the rich should not, they should not change the conditions of the poor or the lower end such that the inequality gap be bridged. All right. So with these four conditions, it's obvious that the international dependence theory became, or the international dependence revolution became pronounced in Africa in particular, and then Latin America and Latin American countries, such that they began to become a bit more Marxist or neo-Marxist, to the extent that some countries in the 70s to 80s, early 80s, the 70s into early 80s, decided that, look, let us grow, those revolutionary countries, let us grow what we eat and eat what we grow. They didn't want to import anything. Yet the mistake is that they want to export to the world, yet they do not want to import. That won't work. Okay, so because that won't work, they decided to close the economy, which is what we call autarky. You cannot go through autarky for a long time. In the long time, there will be economic stagnation, like China did experience until it opened up in 1990. India also did experience, and it opened up in 1997 thereabout, or 2006 thereabout. See, you have to open your country up, open economy. If you close it, you're going to have problems. Nigeria wanted to close some parts of its economy, ban rice from entering the country, and then they should consume only their local rice, but they want others to buy their automobile. It can be funny. To them, to the international dependence revolution, this is the way they must expropriate private properties. Like in South Africa, South Africa is expropriation of the mines and lands like Zimbabwe. That is an extreme condition because they got themselves involved in what we call apartheid. Okay, so then expropriation of, that's what they say, this Marxists and neo-Marxists, they say let's expropriate private lands and private properties, that we bridge the gap between the income gap between the rich and the poor within a certain country and even globally. So then there's going to be a revolution internationally, and then they will pull down the powers of those those rich countries, as well as their representatives in the developing economies. Those are their proposals. The weakness is that one I mentioned, autarky doesn't last long. You'd have to open up. They don't have too many solutions. In the end, we have seen USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, by 1985 pulled down. At the same time, while the 70s into the early 80s, where the West, the liberalists were listening, or USA, UK, Germany, Canada, were watching and listening and learning from the international dependence revolution. They came up with what to call a counter revolution. That's the fourth classical theory of economic development, neoclassical theory of economic development, the neoclassical counter revolution, or what we call the market fundamentalism. They picked it up and they became neoliberals. That was the good thing, was that by 85, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic had then broken up. Once they broke up, the world became unipolar. If you are either with the US or the capitalists or the liberalists or the neoliberalists, or you are nowhere. You have to practice free market economy. Those market impositions, government imposing restrictions, must cease. Corruption, they always blame poverty in developing countries on corruption, government restrictions, government subsidizing products and services in developing countries. They must cease all that and allow free market dictate, demand and supply, to determine the price of goods and services. To them, demand and supply, free market, must be the dictate of the time. African countries and developing countries must participate in their financial markets and in their money markets, where they dictate the pace. Apparently, they determine the price of produce from Africa, and now they want you to list it on their stock market, and they dictate the pace again and the price, the volume and the price. Well, that is what happened in the 80s into the 90s, until World Bank also came up with some models that look, governments are not very good at all at managing countries. Governments are bad managers of countries because of the restrictions they put on imports, such that government benefits, persons in government benefit personally, selfish benefits for themselves by way of bribery. Once they put an import restriction, they can give import licenses to their cronies, and they form that elitist clique. Like in Ghana, they want to put an import restriction on rice, grains, and poultry, just because that will lead to nothing more than what? Bribery and corruption, and creating a certain clique of elitists, which is not proper, leaving majority of the Ghanaians going to be poor. Okay, that is not good, but that's what they want to do. They want to just go back to that kind of system, and Bretton Woods institution says no. Corruption is one of the major problems of developing economies, and so import restrictions and then control of foreign exchange must cease. Demand and supply must determine most of these things, and it must be liberalized market, free market, import and export. If you decide to put a curtain against importation, then you must also put up a curtain against exportation, which is also not possible. Unless you grind down, and if it's not possible and you want to do one, but you want to close one and open the other, like Nigeria did some few years into coronavirus 2021 in terms of rice importation, closed land borders between themselves and Benin, and then some of few countries land borders against rice import into their country. It's not proper. Ghana is taking the same rules. Corruption, they say corruption, governments are just nothing but corrupt institutions. They do nothing but for their selfish gains. They nationalize properties for themselves. In Ghana, for an instance, some government, one particular government, anytime they come into power, they sell state lands to themselves. They sell state lands to themselves as benefit for serving the state. This is what Bretton Woods institution is saying. It is not right. Those are the inefficiencies in developing countries leading to so much poverty. The name is H. Kwame Afaglu. Thank you.